So, so here I am now, and I'm wondering what to do. And so I'm at the moment writing a book on Reggio Emilia as an example of the way in which you combine both a sense of your own personal needs and at the same time relate it to a communal set of requirements.
Sure.
Joining the communal and the personal as one of the great problems of growing up. And I realize as I get to this sort of late in life, I suppose I am, recognizing, my God, this has always been my problem. How do you get beyond the family? And I've various kinds of things. I mean, at one point, I remember thinking as a kid, out in a boat, or something like that, how do people get their idea about crossing waters and so on like that, using the water? Where the hell does that come from? I mean, it doesn't come naturally to anybody. And thinking of that was very interesting. And partly, too, because of the fact that, as I say, my father was a watch manufacturer, and he had a factory, or at least the people who made the movements were in Switzerland, and we were in New York. So he used to travel to Switzerland twice a year. And one of my great excitements was coming in from our hickey place out in the suburbs to see him off. And he would go on all of these famous ships like the Berengaria or the Leviathan. Probably you've never heard of either of them. That's another era. That was before they started flying. And somehow the water, the idea of crossing the water to go into another kind of thing and comparing civilizations had as much effect on me as the general idea of anthropology, the business of going and studying the Cherokee, that had in contrasting the thing that way. So it was partly that, I'm sure, that when the time came, when I got this invitation, I was then teaching at Harvard, and had, if it be permitted on your television thing,
of course,
to say that I had become pissed off with Harvard because Harvard at that particular point had gone very conservative, and it was during the period when there was liberation movement and so on like that.
Was this also the time when there were very behaviorist faculty on the faculty? And
Yeah, they were getting more of them.
They were getting more of them, and you were rejecting that continuously.
Rejecting that, that's right, yeah. That was part of that same thing. So I decided to accept the invitation from Oxford, in spite of the fact that the then president of Harvard said, we would really like to see you stay and see your views enter into this debate. And I felt a little bad about that. But anyway, I went, and so then came the question of, how do I go? I mean, what am I going to do with my beloved Wester Till, my sailboat?
Sure.
So I thought I might ship it on a ship's deck, you know, and discovered that shipping it on a ship's deck to England would cost twice as much as the boat had cost me, because I had bought the boat for practically nothing from a very wealthy colleague who was vice president of Harvard, a guy by the name of Dick Pratt. It was a beautiful wooden boat. So I decided that the only thing to do was to sail it across. And I thought, could I gather a crew? And then, rather than their being reluctant, as soon as I mentioned, bang, yes, I want to come.
How many people were your crew?
Yeah. Well,
6 of you?
Yeah, we had 2 watches of 3 each. You go by watches.
And how long did it take you to cross?
About 16 or 17, about 17 days.
17 days. Yeah. Quite the adventure. Before you left, I wanted to touch on something. Colwyn Treverthen, I've talked to him, and he said that one of your most significant accomplishments in terms of what he thought was your directing and developing or founding of the Harvard University Center of Cognitive Studies.
Center for Cognitive Studies, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that before we cross the Atlantic and go to Oxford.
Yeah. Let me tell you about that. That's kind of interesting. Harvard, at that particular point, was moving, on the one hand, toward kind of a Skinnerian behaviorism,
Mm-hmm.
and all to fit both man and pigeon.
And baboon.
And well, he didn't. No,
Oh, he didn't
Fred
do
would
baboon.
never work on anything as advanced as baboons. Pigeons was as high as he went. I think he may have worked on rats too. That on the one hand, and then the big cultural side of
Sure.
what is Andean culture like, or history of Chinese culture, where somehow the individual people disappeared. You know. So, how did you put the question to me?
Tell us about the Harvard Center, the
For
University
cognitive-
Center
yeah,
for Cognitive
right.
Studies that you developed.
So, what? And the combination of behaviorism and total culturalism like that left out man and his thought processes and his problem solving and so on like that. Pigeons may be okay if you want to study the way they peck at a button, and Bolivian culture may be okay if you want to study it, but what about people in a situation like that? So George Miller, who was teaching over in the Skinnerian dominated psychology department, and I was teaching in the increasingly culturally dominated Department of Social Relations, decided, why are we spending all of our goddamn time fighting with our colleagues about intellectual? We were not fighting personally, but both of us, I think, had fairly good relationships.
Sure.
So we decided that maybe we ought to set up a center. I had brought a little group together in a little house on Bow Street, which we had rented with funds from foundations and so on, where we'd got some of those together. We decided we'd set a whole thing up. So we decided we would set this Center for Cognitive and make it a kind of a department status kind of thing. And we went to Paul Buck, who was then the dean, and thinking we had to get permission to do this, to get it like that. Thinking, boy, are we going to run into resistance? And thinking of all of the arguments we would have to use. When we posed the idea to Paul Buck, he said, what a splendid idea. We've all been worried about what's been happening with the human sciences here. Go to it. So he gave us the 10th and 11th floor of William James Hall, this brand new gorgeous building up there.
And that's where it started.
So then John Gardner was then the head of the Carnegie Corporation, Carnegie Foundation in New York. And I had known John since we were way back, when we were students together at Harvard. Went to see if we could get a grant, thinking, well, we'll get a grant. I got the same response, what a great idea. And so we started off what in those days was a big hunk of dough with an initial $300,000 grant. And we started bringing in people from all over the world.
Studying cognitive.
And that's how Colwyn got into it. Have you met Colwyn, or is this all correspondence?
No, just all correspondence online. Yeah.
He's a charmer, you'll love him. So there we were. And this group brought together with a lot of, Patty Greenfield was a graduate student in those days. You have met, you said no, you have not met Patty. No, you have not met any of these people. You need a better air ticket. Within 5 or 6 years, it was the place where all the people, the bright younger group in psychology wanted to come, and we had this one fantastic collection. I mean, 2 of them, for example, one of them just won a Nobel Prize, Danny Kahneman, just won the Nobel Prize. Danny and Amos Tversky were working together. Amos died, alas, about 5 years ago, although his wife is still here in New York. She's very nice. So they came in and we started turning out stuff like that. And then George and I, in place of the introductory psychology course, gave a year-long gen ed course at Harvard on man and society, whatever it's called, humanity and culture, or whatever it was called, like that. And it was packed. Students wanted this kind of thing. And at the end of the year, when the Harvard Crimson ran its poll, it was one of the 2 top chosen things as for teaching at Harvard.
Wow.
So, those things, winning prizes, like when I won the Balzan Prize, which was nice because I think it was $275,000 or something like that, but it's for contributions to the understanding of humanity. It's supposed to be the counterpart of the Nobel Prize, and financed by money from the Milanese newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, who were filthy rich, and plus a rich Swiss family. When success and prizes and that kind of thing always put me in a slight tizzy. I mean, it's a tizzy made up partly of the fact that I have oversold it. I'm being a phony or something of the sort, and I hate that feeling. But you know it very well. And then the other kind of thing was that what it does is to concentrate the opposition. So that, for example, now that the cognitive revolution has sort of swept America, the ones who remain as behaviorists might as well be Jesuits, you know.
Right. Right.
It's a kind of religious kind of. So I like an open society. But anyway, the Center for Cognitive Studies had a huge effect.
Huge effect. Andrew Metzoff is another one of your former mentees. And he wrote and published an article about you as his mentor in GQ magazine. And he wrote in there that you revolutionized psychology in America by establishing this center. Your interdisciplinary center practiced a new kind of psychology, one that talked about people's minds, not rats' behavior. So we really have you to thank for the whole cognitive.
Did Andy say that?
He did, yeah. Now, Howard Gardner, I talked to him as well, and he recalls a conference in Paris during which he was dining with scholars from around the world. Each and every one of them had something in common, one thing, and that one person was you. You had inspired all of them at the table to become educational researchers because they had all read your book, The Process of Education, the same book that the Harvard Press
which had a very good translation into French, by the way.
Which has a very, yes. He says you can imagine the shock of a book which did not talk about IQ or reinforcement, especially at the Skinnerian time, as you mentioned, and which placed broad disciplinary understandings at the center of education, which was again groundbreaking, especially at this time.
Isn't it amazing that that should be groundbreaking?
Common
sense says that
but
should.
we have you to thank that we say that now, because it doesn't
delighted.
seem.
You're most welcome. If I can put it that way. But then, I'm sorry.
No, go
Please,
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to move on to another topic, so continue.
Go ahead. No, I was going to go on to how I happened to get into law, and I'll come to that in a little
Okay.
bit. Go ahead.
You also, another person, Michael Cole, I talked to him. He said that you share a great admiration for Alexander Romanovich Luria.
Luria, yeah.
Who is Alexander Luria to you? How has he influenced you, Alexander Luria?
He first came on a visit to America, and I met him, and I had not yet published very much in the, I had some, yeah, he knew some of the things. So we talked about the thought processes and strategies of thinking and stylistic patterns that grow up on how you use your mind and so on like that. And I thought, good God, here's a guy 5,000 miles away I can talk to more readily than some of my colleagues
at Harvard
across on the other side.
Yeah.
I've got a thing like that. I've got to go over to Harvard. It was the effect of Luria, who had been principally influenced by his teacher, who was a man by the name of Lev Vygotsky.
Sure.
Remember that name, yeah. And so we started corresponding. And I would try out articles. You're going to laugh. I mean, things that I was published, I thought I should try them out and see how my Russian colleagues like this. So I would send them to him, and he would send back sometimes commentary as long as the article. So finally, he said, "Why don't you come on a visit?" the Russia. I had never been to Russia before. And so I went on what was the first of maybe 4 or 5, right? And I found these young Russian scholars in cognitive science who were battling against Pavlov in much the same way as I had been battling against the Skinnerian kind of approach.
Sure.
So it was hail fellows well met, plus the fact that I rather like Russian culture. There's something about the Russians that's very personal. And so we got on very well, and I had known, the person who had done a lot of the arranging of these things, the details and so on, who knew how to do it, was a colleague of mine at Harvard by the name of Genia Honfman. Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She was a wonderful person. She was Russian. And so she managed to get all the millions of dirt work things out of the way, going through the whatever you have to go through on the Russian thing like that. So I made my first visit, and it was fantastic. I loved, not so much Russia, but I loved this new group that was finding a new way of speaking that was not just in psychology, but was to be what the new Russia is.
Mm-hmm.
It was breaking away from the kind of, rather than the Pavlovian, the Stalinist kind of thing of finding the importance of spontaneity, and their emphasis was on developing a sense of the possible, and that appealed to me enormously. So we got to be very, very close friends, and we had that in common. We had one other thing in common, which will abuse you. He and me alike come from Jewish backgrounds. Not completely, that is not all of them. Some of them. With not 1 ounce of religious interest or impulse in our bodies. But there's some interesting kind of way where in that background there's a sort of stream of what I want to call Jewish skepticism and self-mockery that protects you to some extent from stuffiness, that kind of big stuffy. This is how I think it is, and that's how it is, and all that kind of thing. And he served very much that role among the Russians, the young Russians, and God, you would love those kids. they'd come to Moscow, many of them from hick towns out in the country, mm-hmm. and those hick towns were so, rigidly Stalinist and so on like that. So they got to this free thing, and we would have lots of fun. They knew all sorts of places that were trying out a new Russian version of jazz. You can imagine what it was like. Not very good, but it was an interesting kind of thing. When A Study of Thinking came out, the first translation of A Study of Thinking was into what language? Russian. And so I started corresponding. And the influence that they've had on me has been mostly very much like the influence, for example, that Reggio Emilia has had in terms of looking at the way in which you conduct our education, the contrast business. And the comparative perspective is, I think, so important. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to have departments, psychological departments, where you don't have just one standard, blah, 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 this is the point of view, stick with it. Give them a chance to battle back and forth. Not necessarily battle, but tattle back and forth would be better, yeah.
Now, you wrote the introduction to Vygotsky Stanton language, is that right? And that was suppressed by Soviet authorities for over 20 years.
That was what?
Suppressed by Soviet authorities, suppressed.
That book had been suppressed.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah. Mm.
And you were most instrumental also in introducing Vygotsky to American scholars. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, you brought him over to across the seas.
Yeah.